there's this question that you'll get if you are someone who is doing a PhD, or if you've done one, or even if you're thinking about doing one. What'll happen is that one day a friend will come up to you and they'll say, "Oh, hey, how you doing? How is the PhD going?" And you go, "It's fine. It's so fine." And you'll start talking and you'll catch up, and then eventually they'll ask you a question. They'll ask you this question. They'll look at you and they'll say, "So, I've been thinking, do you think I should do a PhD?" And you'll go, In their 2011 book, the writer and critical theorist Lauren Berlant talks about the idea of cruel optimism. Now, we might think this sounds like a contradiction in terms, but as Berlant points out, optimism is not just about looking on the bright side. Optimism is ambitious. It is a force that pushes us out into the world to try and get something that we don't have within ourselves and something that we can't get from ourselves. And the reason that we go out and try and obtain this object is that we think that by getting close to this object, by getting it, we're going to get ourselves closer to the end point of philosophy itself, our version of living the good life. This doesn't have to be a thing, of course. It doesn't have to be something that you go out and purchase. It could be a job, it could be a hypothetical situation, it could even be a person. But the reason that we want it is because it represents something that we are in some way missing. For Berlant, then, optimism is a kind of fantasy, a story that we tell ourselves, a means by which we can structure and channel our desires. It's a way of making sense on a day-to-day level of who we are and who we want to be. This isn't just a personal thing either. Berlant goes so far as to claim that cruel optimism is one of the things which structures all of contemporary capitalist society. We exist in a world which depends upon a kind of generally shared notion of what the good life looks like. So, in order to make us aspire towards it, we exist within a world which also tries to get us to aspire to certain normative futures, these commonly accepted notions about what we should be like, this idea that everybody should get married, everybody should have children, everybody should buy a house. And the idea is that doing those things will add up to success, they'll add up to living that good life. The reason that these fantasies, that these potential futures that we are supposed to be optimistic about are important is because they provide a general conception of the world adding up to something, of the world making sense in some way. After all, if the system is able to deliver what it promises us, then perhaps there's reason to be optimistic about the societies in which we live and the things that we're supposed to be aspiring towards. However, the problems come in, according to Berlant, when what happens if this system starts to break down? What happens if it starts to fail? What happens if the things that we are supposed to be working towards can no longer deliver the positive outcomes they've promised us? I think we only need to look around to realize that this is exactly what's been happening. From kind of a subjective level to issues such as job security, social and political equality, all of the systems which have promised us certain outcomes if we aspire towards certain goals have started to fracture. As Berlant puts it at the very beginning of the book, a relationship of cruel optimism exists when something you desire is actually an obstacle to you flourishing. To see what I mean, you only need to look at the idea of work. We're told that work is incredibly important. Work makes us productive, and having a job is supposed to give meaning to our lives. Getting that promotion, getting that raise, means everything is going to turn out okay. However, due to a whole host of factors, such as precarious employment, zero-hour contracts, the absence of a robust trade union movement, and a whole host of other things, work can often be something which is scarce, insecure, vulnerable, and deeply exploited. Often what happens then is that people will end up feeling personally at fault for a wider systemic problem. If we don't have a job, it's because we haven't worked hard enough. If we aren't paid enough to live on, it's because we need to hustle harder. All this does is disguise the systemic issues of capitalism whilst making us all feel personally at fault. So, should you do that PhD? I get asked this question a lot, whether through my job or through people who found my work online, and I always find it a really hard question to answer. It would be easy, it's tempting even to just go, yeah, of course, why not? What's the worst that can happen? But having done a PhD, I know that that kind of answer just would not be honest. Did you see that just last year there was the first ever international conference dedicated to exploring why PhD students have such poor mental health? There was a study from Belgium that found that PhD students were twice as likely as the general population to develop a mental health issue. And there was a survey from the States which showed that 75% of PhD students rated their stress as being somewhere between more than average and tremendous. Links to both of those studies down below. Graduate study doesn't just take a toll on your mental health either. PhD students are often deeply economically insecure and frequently struggle to make ends meet. On the promise of a future career, PhD students are a great source of cheap labour that's easy to exploit. Furthermore, given the ever-increasing marketisation of higher education, which has turned the university into a giant corporate structure, it's often a very hostile place for PhD students. Students who are poor or working class, LGBT, people of colour, or all of these factors and more are at risk not only of institutional neglect and institutionalised racism and oppression, but also economic vulnerability. Essentially, what graduate school involves is a huge amount of stress, a huge amount of precarity, and a huge amount of exploitation. Labour that's frequently done with little or no reward, only the future promise that one day all of this will have been worth it. So, what grad school involves is a huge amount of precarity, a huge amount of stress, exploitation, and the constant drive to be always producing. To see what this looks like in practice, we only need to look at what's been happening to the PhD students, teaching assistants, and graduate students at UC Santa Cruz. Living in one of the most expensive parts of the US, huge amounts of the students at UCSC didn't make enough to cover their living expenses. These people weren't just students. They were doing pretty much the same job as the full-time faculty, whilst also trying to do advanced research degrees, whilst at the same time having almost zero institutional power. These were teachers, they mentored students, they published their work, they did everything right. And it was still not enough. Most PhD students are given the job of teaching undergraduate courses, and so when they went on strike to try and improve their conditions, they were fired by the university. All that work, all that effort that would have paid off one day was taken away when students got just a little too inconvenient. It was a relationship of cruel optimism. The university was happy to take advantage of their labour, but as soon as the students started to ask for what the university, whether implicitly or explicitly, had promised them, like secure employment and a good standard of living, they were completely disposable. Donate to the strike fund, link down below. So, why do we keep going? What is it that makes us keep chasing after things, that working towards something that we know can never deliver what we've been promised? I went into a PhD thinking the same way that most people do, that I was going to be someone who worked in a university, that was going to be my career, that was going to be my version of the good life. And I spent years feeling like a failure, feeling like I hadn't worked hard enough, feeling like maybe I just wasn't smart enough to be part of that system. And I should point out, I was one of the lucky ones. For Berlant, we think this way because we don't yet have any other way of making sense of the world that we live in and the future that we want. But this raises a really important challenge. And this is why it's important, I think, to talk about the prevalence of cruel optimism in contemporary capitalist society. What we need is not new things to be optimistic about, but new narratives that we can tell ourselves. Things that we can aspire towards that don't necessarily engender that same cruel attachment. It's important to point out that none of this is personal. Nothing here is a reflection on any one individual. Berlant goes so far as to argue that cruel optimism structures everything from political commitments to romantic attachments. But what's needed are new criteria, new ways of thinking and creating and dreaming about a potential good life in the future, something that we can all collectively build together. To go back to that question of what you should do if you're thinking about going down this route, if you're thinking about doing a PhD, we have to think very carefully about what optimistic attachments are promising us, and think honestly and critically about whether they can deliver the things that we really want. People go into a PhD for a whole host of different reasons, but we have to be able to know and make a good judgment about whether doing a PhD is going to deliver the positive outcomes that have driven us towards it. After all, doing a PhD carries risks. The higher education system can be an institutionally racist, exclusionary, and violent place. But there is also the potential chance that within it, we might find new attachments that don't generate the same cruelty and dissolution. So, is there a question that you have? A question that drives you? A question that you can't not want to answer? A question, after all, doesn't promise a better life. All a question promises is the potential possibility of an answer.